Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Connecting California, Solving the Digital Divide. My name is Miguel Leon, Senior Program Manager with the Michelson 20mm Foundation. I use pronouns he, him, his, and I'm coming to you from Tongva ancestral lands. I am a Latinx male with black hair combed to the side, brown eyes, black rimmed glasses, and I'm wearing a light blue and white checkered shirt with a gray coat. Before we get started with today's discussion, I'd like to share a little bit about our foundation. Founded by Dr. Gary K. Michelson and Alia Michelson, the Michelson 20mm Foundation is dedicated to ensuring that everyone, particularly our most vulnerable populations, has access to the equitable post-secondary educational opportunities that lead to meaningful careers. As part of our mission, we are committed to building awareness of and working to close the digital divide so that everyone has the ability to attend classes, find and apply for jobs, access telemedicine, learn of and manage public assistance programs, and more. Our Connecting California series and today's discussion are part of our broader digital equity initiative. The series has included 8 prior events zeroing in on various themes, including the history and root causes of digital inequity, the role that race plays in digital inequity, and it's also uplifted exemplars of public-private partnerships whose cross-sectoral efforts are making a difference for communities and people in need. Today, we aim to provide an update on the historic investment made by the federal government in broadband. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has the potential to transform our country and get us as close as we ever have been to digital equity. But what money has gone where? And what opportunities remain to leverage those dollars at the state and local level? Our expert panel will answer these questions and more. Before we begin the discussion, I'd like to read remarks from our founder and co-chair, Dr. Gary K. Michelson. From Dr. Michelson. Good morning. Thank you for joining us once again for our ongoing conversation on closing the digital divide. Since we were last together, our Michelson 20mm Foundation has continued to invest in digital navigator efforts in California to help connect our residents to telehealth, remote learning, and many other public social services. We have continued to elevate the voices of community and have brought together a network of nonprofit partners to educate funders on the digital needs of our citizens. We have continued our work to help empower leaders of our tribal nations to connect their communities and much, much more. But I have always believed that government is the great lever, and we are here today to discuss what is truly a generational opportunity. As the single largest federal investment in broadband in US history, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act presents a chance to catalyze improved access for communities that have been digitally redlined for decades. However, we must ensure that equity is at the forefront of implementation. Today, we will hear from experts immersed in protecting the equitable rollout of this program. We must not allow this historic investment to simply perpetuate the monopolies of powerful internet service providers. We cannot continue to prioritize profits over people. Thank you again for your attendance, and we hope today's discussion inspires you to join us in this movement. Please enjoy. Those were words from our founder and co-chair, Dr. Gary K. Michelson. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. We have a fantastic group of experts ready to share their wisdom and expertise with you. With us this morning, we have Amy Huffman, Policy Director at the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Amy joined NDIA in 2021. Prior to that, Amy served as the state of North Carolina's first digital inclusion and policy manager for the Broadband Infrastructure Office. She is a public servant, a systems thinker, an innovative policy expert, and a storyteller with a passion for closing the digital divide and ensuring all Americans can thrive in the 21st century digital world. Welcome, Amy. Also with us is Drew Gardner, who serves as a state broadband policy fellow at Common Sense Media, where he works to help state policymakers navigate federal funding opportunities and design programs that close the digital divide. Prior to joining Common Sense, Drew worked in the US Senate, in state government, and for NBC News. Drew, thanks for being with us today. Also with us is Adriana Sanchez Ochoa, Deputy Director at NextGen Policy. At NextGen, Adriana works on immigration, women's issues, digital inclusion, and equity and environmental justice. Before joining NextGen Policy team, Adriana spent 18 years working in the California legislature in various key positions. Bienvenida, Adriana. Moderating our panel today is our dear friend and partner, Adrian Benton Furness. Adrian is Executive Director, Board Member, and Trustee of the Benton Institute for Broadband and Society, a private operating foundation based in the Chicago area. Benton believes everyone in the US must have access to the infrastructure of opportunity, open, affordable, high-performance broadband, and the skills to make use of it if we are to become a more equitable society. For 40 years, the Benton Institute has helped strengthen communities by advancing communications policy in the public interest while providing day-to-day support and resources to the community of people who care about broadband for all. Adrian, it's an honor and a privilege to have you with us once again. The mic is yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you to everyone who's here today on what I gather is a very busy day in California. And so we appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule. And thank you so much, Miguel, for having us all here and for bringing me back for my third time, either moderating or presenting at a Connecting California webinar. So, I mean, if I were Sally Field, I'd say something like, well, you all like me, which, you know, is wonderful. So thanks again. Drew, maybe you might share the slides and we can kick off that kind introduction. We can go right to the next slide. And what I wanted to do was just put the mission statements of all the organizations that are represented by people on the call. Some of us are strictly policy shops or think tanks. Common Sense obviously is working really at the intersections of kids and the world of media and technology. National Digital Inclusion Alliance obviously focused on inclusion and equity and does a really great job with a very large national practitioner community. And then NextGen Policy, who I'm meeting for the first time on this call, is a partner organization or sister organization with Common Sense focused on making sure that the California General Assembly and various groups are all marching in the right direction for the public interest in California. So thanks very much again to my fellow panelists for being here. And why don't we go to the next slide, Drew? So again, my role here today is to give you some background information. Some of this you all may know, so I'll breeze through it so we can get to the meat of the matter. These are the key institutions that deal with broadband at the federal level. The independent regulatory agency, the Federal Communications Commission, is in business to advance affordability and universal service, and does our mapping and thinks about the rules and regulations surrounding the programs that it administers. But there are really three main federal executive departments that are managing broadband. And of course, the one we're going to focus on today is the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or what we'll call the NTIA. Though, of course, the Department of Agriculture is working through its rural utility services in rural areas. And then we can't forget about the US Department of Treasury that sort of entered the game with the capital funds project that I'll talk about on the next slide. There have been 4 major pieces of legislation over the last couple of years. We started with the CARES Act in 2020. moved quickly with, of course, the pandemic lighting the fire under everyone's behinds to get to the Consolidated Appropriations Act, where the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program was implemented, and 3 programs that were administered by the NTIA. One for tribal broadband connectivity, one broadly for the broadband infrastructure deployment, and then the third called Connecting Minority Communities. It's a pilot program and really works with HBCUs, tribal colleges, and other minority serving institutions around the country to advance broadband in their surrounding communities. Last year, a little over a year ago, was the American Rescue Plan. And I wanted to mention this because the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund, there's $10 billion for states, territories, and tribal governments to carry out critical capital projects like infrastructure funding, broadband infrastructure funding. And it's a very flexible pot of money, perhaps more flexible than what we're going to focus on today. The other program as part of the American Rescue Plan Act was the Emergency Connectivity Fund. Last week was the last amount of money, about $1 billion, that was opened up for applications that were due, Drew, I think May 13th, just nod your head. But we bring this up because this is a finite amount of cash. And when this money is finished, a whole slew of kids are going to be unconnected again. And so it's very important to keep in mind that we either need to put more money into that pot, or states or municipalities, states, regions, or municipalities will have to do the job that this fund has done before. On this call today, we're going to talk about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, known as IIJA, and we're going to focus, though there are more programs than the 3 listed on this slide, we're going to focus on these 3. And the biggest one, of course, is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, called BEAD. And then there's the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program, which is the successor program to the Emergency Broadband Benefit. And then we're going to talk about Digital Equity Act. So I wanted at this particular point, if we would go to the next slide, Drew, to make sure that all of us understand that there are some, first of all, wonderful resources out there for you all. And this one was created by Common Sense Media. It's become my new favorite go-to. And this is the author of this has joined us today, Drew Garner. And it's, you'd have to get a magnifying glass out to see the entire chart, but we will at the end of the day give you a resource to link to this. But it does, as the right-hand side of this slide tells you, give you the program name, an acronym, and a short description, the originating law and administering agency, gives you the funding amount. I know that's what we're all focused on, the allocation method, and the eligible recipients, and then gives a timeline, use categories, and additional resources. Now, of course, part of the reason I love this is that those resources on the right-hand side actually have a lot of links to Benton explainers. So, you know, I gotta love Drew for doing that. Today, we're going to focus, as I said, on the top 3 orange entries. BEAD, the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program, which has $60 million for planning available. That's very important, and Amy will talk about that. And the Affordable Connectivity Program. I mentioned the other 2 because you know, we wanted you to know that those funds are still open, or we just have to keep an eye on ECF, as I said before. Okay, Drew, next slide. Okay, I want to make sure everybody gets on the same page about the definitions we use. for digital equity and digital inclusion. These definitions were developed by NDIA, and Benton first published them back in 2016. So we're almost 6 years into having defined those for the field, and they've been widely adopted. We like to say BEAD without equity is bad, right? And so that's part of the thing that we like to emphasize, is that in order to really make sure we're delivering on the promise of these federal monies, we have to build equity into every single thing we're doing here. The covered populations gets used, that terminology gets used a lot over the course of these various notice of funding opportunities that we'll talk about. And there's this definition here. Please don't feel like you, by the way, have to read all of this stuff or that we're moving too fast, because Miguel tells me that the slides will be made available to people who've signed up after the fact. Drew, next slide. And this one I love. This is actually another few terms that get used throughout, what we call unserved areas, underserved areas, and served areas. And really the way we have looked at this is the ability of households and the number of people who sign up and the number of devices that may be used simultaneously. How much bandwidth, up and down speeds, do you need to be able to do all of these activities, these internet uses that are laid out at the bottom of the screen? So unserved is considered anything less than the federal definition, the current federal definition of broadband, which is 25 megabits down and 3 up. Underserved would mean that people lack access to 100 download speed and 20 upload. Now notice how we're still not at symmetrical speeds here, which of course would be ideal. That's Benton's perspective. But upload speeds in this world are becoming increasingly important because so much of our daily lives have been transitioned to being online, and farmers, for instance, need really robust upload speeds. Even the applications we're using today also demand those better upload speeds. And so that ends my presentation of giving you all some background, and I'm now going to turn it over to Drew, who will start with talking about the ACP. Thanks, Drew.
Yeah. And just to round out this slide, just to get a sense of what unserved, underserved, and served actually mean to a family, you can look at, like, for a family of 5 that is unserved, they're going to have to choose between 2 of these uses. Like, that's, so you have 5 people in the household, you can only do 2 of these things simultaneously. All of these are important to any family. So we just want to emphasize the fact that these families in unserved and underserved areas are being forced to choose between essential activities. So that's one takeaway to just keep in mind, that the internet is the underlying infrastructure for everything. And the less bandwidth you have, the less you can do or engage in modern society. This mostly refers to access to that quality internet, which is an infrastructure term. Are you able to get internet? It doesn't really talk about affordability. So for this, in addition to having the infrastructure or the access, you also have to be able to afford the service. Both of these are huge barriers to getting online. In fact, a lot of studies sometimes find that the affordability of internet is an even larger barrier to access. And for California, this slide just highlights, you can see that for households that are below 200% of the federal poverty line, about 16% of those don't have any connectivity. So they're not able to use any of those essential services. And then an additional 10% are only connected by their phone. So together, that's about 1 out of 4 Californian households. And in this low income bracket are unable to access these essential services. And so to remedy that, the federal government recently created the ACP. And the ACP is a $30 monthly benefit for internet service. So eligible households are able to enroll in this program, and every month they will get $30 to use to afford internet. For some little extras, you can see down here, it's $75 on tribal lands, and then there's also a one-time benefit for devices. You get one benefit per household, but only one member of the household must qualify. So like, for instance, if your child goes to a school where they receive free and reduced lunch, like then that makes them eligible for the ACP. And so the whole household can use the benefit. And as Adriana said earlier, this is formerly known as the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. And there's currently a $14 billion appropriation. We hope to make it, which will last for a long time. Estimates are around 4 years. And one of our goals, and we hope you join us in this, is to advocate for continued funding for the ACP, because it's going to be very important to keep this program around for as long as we need it, which will be forever, because there will always be poverty. And so we will always need some sort of cost support. Here are some of the enrollment or guidelines. This is how to qualify. Below 200% of the poverty line, you can see, and then also participation in one of these programs. All you need is to meet one criteria, and you're in. The Biden-Harris White House recently had an announcement, and I'll go quickly through this, but it's a priority to enroll as many people in this program as possible. So the Biden-Harris is partnering with agencies, states and cities, and advocates to spread the word and to support enrollment, because critically, it can be very hard to enroll in this program. It is free money, but it takes a lot of work to, one, go through the enrollment process, and then two, to go find an ISP to sign you up. And so the type of work Amy is doing in her organization of digital inclusion and helping people to enroll in programs like this is critical to making this program succeed. And then in addition, a lot of ISPs, about 20 ISPs have answered Biden's call to reduce the cost of some of their low income program service offerings, and then also to offer faster download speeds. So these ISPs are offering a $30 plan. And so a $30 plan plus the ACP, it means free internet, which is critical. And this is just to give you a sense of perspective of why California or any state wants to boost enrollment in this program as much as possible. About 48 million households qualify for the ACP. That's about 40%, or that's 40% of the households in America. 11 million are currently enrolled. So we got about 1 in 5 households, eligible households, is currently enrolled. Those households that are enrolled will be getting $360 a year, 30 times 12. And then that number times 1.5 million, that's how many are enrolled in California. That means California is getting over $500 million a year through the ACP. If California can increase enrollment from its current 1 in 5 eligible households to 2 in 5, that would bring an additional $2.5 billion to California for affordable broadband over the course of 5 years. So it is in the state's incentive to enroll as many people as they can, not only because the internet is essential, but also because it's going to bring a lot of cost support into the state. Common Sense and many other organizations are currently actively trying to boost those enrollment numbers. Here is a slide with data from the California Community Foundation. This is a great bit of research that they've done. So the ACP is important because it allows people to afford the internet, low-income households to afford the internet. But critically, low-income neighborhoods often have higher costs than higher income neighborhoods. So if you live in a high-income neighborhood, it's likely that your internet will be cheaper. If you live in a low-income neighborhood, your internet might be more expensive, which is counterintuitive, but it's true, because ISPs historically, for obvious reasons, have invested in the places of higher return. So the low-income neighborhoods have aging infrastructure, just less infrastructure. And so the cost for service is higher and the service quality is lower. Like this speed of 1 megabyte per second for $55 a month is crazy. You can't live a normal life with that. That's about enough to do emails and basic internet browsing for one person. And for the same amount of money, you can get 75 megabytes, good speeds in a more high income neighborhood. So this is something that we call digital redlining. It is just that historic underinvestment in vulnerable minority and low income communities. All of this to say is that simply having a subsidy program, the ACP alone will not solve this because of digital redlining, because the actual infrastructure in these neighborhoods is not there. Only subsidizing the cost isn't enough. And that leads us into BEAD, which is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. This is an NT. The ACP was the FCC's program. BEAD is an NTIA program. But BEAD, this is the big one, $42.5 billion grant program for broadband infrastructure. And we'll talk about this asterisk later. But most of it currently is envisioned for infrastructure. The way BEAD works broadly is a 100-page document that was recently released that goes into detail. This is broad strokes. Broadly, states will get block grants. They'll get a big allocation of money that the state can then use to administer and fund their own competitive sub-grant program. So states are guaranteed, there's a formula that's upcoming that will decide how much each state is going to get. And that formula is going to be based on the percentage of unserved households in the state. Unserved, again, we talked about that earlier. So that's going to determine how much each state gets. And then the state will take that money and competitively distribute it. This money, again, is going to states first, and then they will sub-grant it. So states, DC, and territories, Puerto Rico, those are who will get this money. And the highlights is that BEAD is beginning, according to the rules and our interpretation so far, it looks like it will create very fast, affordable, and universally accessible internet. Very good. It will require community engagement. So these ISPs and states will have to work with community members. They'll have to find vulnerable communities and bring them into the process. That's critical because that's how we're going to know where to build it and what kind of broadband to give them. And then also, these states are going to have to coordinate their BEAD program with the Digital Equity Act programs that Amy will talk about later, and the middle mile programs. These states are going to have to make sure that their new infrastructure works well with these other initiatives. And as a network, having coordination between all the moving parts is very important. And just so you know who to call your governor's office or their designee. They're the ones who are responsible for deciding who gets to spend this money. The goal, all Americans have fast, affordable internet. It'll be a formula allocation. We talked about that earlier. The FCC is currently working on maps, and those maps are going to determine where broadband is in America. They're going to be new maps. They're going to be by location. So hopefully by household, we'll be able to tell who has it and who doesn't. And that is going to let us, we're going to plug that data into the formula and get the amount each state will get. But these maps are critical. They're not done yet. Maybe in fall, it's not clear. We'll talk about those later. And then some key documents, letter of intent, 5-year plan, initial proposal. We'll go into these in detail later. And then upcoming deadlines, just so you know, May 13th is when they release that 100-page document of rules, which all of us have been reading through. And July 18th, letter of intent due, we'll get to that. And August 15th, application funds, we'll get to that too. Okay, so here is the first thing, the thing you can do today, or the thing your governor's designee can do today, is to submit a letter of intent. Literally this is the template. All you have to do is plug your name in. Submit this to the NTIA and you will get $5 million to use on planning activities. So that's all of this stuff right here. Just send this letter to somebody, get $5 million. That's pretty incredible to me. And one of the activities you can cover with that $5 million are any costs associated with submitting the letter of intent. So it pays for itself. So we're encouraging everyone to do this. And by requesting this money, you are required to create a 5-year plan, which is a good idea. And that plan is just a high-level overview of the broadband, how you're going to use BEAD money. And it should include all of these elements. So your own maps, your budgeting, how you're going to lay out your broadband shop, how you're going to engage the community, all that stuff should go into the 5-year plan. So you can start planning today and you get paid $5 million to do it. Every state should do this. And look how simple that letter is. Just put your name right in the template. Here's a timeline of BEAD. We're right here. The guide just came out. So you submit your letter of intent, get $5 million, make your 5-year plan. About the time that's, well, make your 5-year plan, have that done. And then after the maps, after those FCC maps are done, maybe this fall, after those start, then that starts the clock on doing your initial proposal, which is a more detailed how you're going to implement a grant program, a sub-grant program. And once you get that done, you will get 20% of your total allocation. So that's going to be a lot of money. And then you start implementing it, and then you get to the final proposal, which will give you the remainder of the money. That's all out in the future, 2023 beyond. For now, start planning. Here is a breakdown of what the grants are actually going to do. So when the state gets its money, this is what it can do with it. So there's a tiering system of ways that the states have to spend their money. First, they have to connect, before they can do anything else, they have to create a plan to connect all unserved areas, all unserved locations. And again, that's the 25-3 definition. So any block or any geographic region in which 80% of the households or locations lack 25-3, you have to spend money there first, or you have to have a plan for how you're going to connect all those places. Once you do that, you can move on to connecting underserved households and locations. And that again is 120, so slightly better internet. Then you move on to those. And once you have a plan to connect all of those areas, you can start building connectivity for anchor institutions, which is like hospitals, parks, schools, libraries, government buildings. You can also add things to that definition. So building internet to the anchor institutions or non-deployment activities, which is like device programs. I see a question. Are only state agencies able to apply? Yes, only state agencies are able to apply for any of this money right now. Your state will use this money to create a program and you can apply to that. So non-deployment things are device subsidy programs. So once you have allocated all your money to connect unserved and underserved areas, the remainder can be used for this third tier of programs. NTIA encourages connectivity to anchor institutions, but you can also do non-deployment. And then, so how do you win one of these grants? These are the criteria NTIA requires you to consider. The NTIA encourages states to create a point system, basically. So the state will review proposals and award points to certain parts based on these criteria. Well, first, are you doing a all fiber network, fiber end to end? That is one of the most highly prioritized criteria. Projects that are doing all fiber, those will get the first review, and those compete against each other. And if there are no proposals for fiber end to end, then they will consider other technologies in most cases. So are you using fiber? That's number one. And fiber, I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but fiber provides the fastest, most scalable, and affordable type of internet. It's you basically put fiber in the ground. It's a big upfront infrastructure investment, but it pays off over the years. So this BEAD is very much prioritizing fiber, long-term scalable networks. Then the primary criteria for choosing between grants is minimizing BEAD outlays. So how much BEAD is going to, getting down the amount BEAD has to kick in for the project. So if the ISP is willing to pay for 50% of it, and BEAD only has to pay the other 50%, that will award that proposal extra points. Also, how affordable is the service going to be? And then are you going to use fair labor practices? Those are primary criteria. Secondary criteria are how quickly can you get this network running? And if you're not using fiber, how fast, how good is the quality of service going to be? And then additional criteria NTIA suggests you should consider are how are you going to treat the workforce? Are you going to be equitable workforce and job quality? Are you going to bring in historically neglected communities to the workforce? Are you going to have an open access network, which means that that inspires competition because multiple providers can operate on the same infrastructure? And then how good is your local coordination? Those are all factors in who wins the grants. These are great criteria because they encourage good programs. So we were happy to see this. Here's just a quote from the document that I appreciated. This is from the 100-page Notice of Funding Opportunity. Only end-to-end fiber will ensure that the networks built by the project can easily scale speeds over time to meet the evolving connectivity needs of households and businesses, and support the deployment of 5G, successor wireless technologies, and other advanced services. So this is a government saying that fiber is the answer to a lot of our connectivity problems. And this is referencing the law that was passed, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So this is NTIA's interpretation of that legal requirement, which we were happy to see. This, and I will go through this quickly just to make time for everyone else, but this is just a list of the obligations on the eligible entity, which is again is a state, territory, DC, and then the subgrantee obligations. And I'm just going to talk about 3 of these points. The first one is that states have to allow all types of providers to compete in the grant process. This is very good because that means public entities like governments and municipal broadband providers, cooperatives, they can compete for this money. And we think that a lot of times those municipal solutions are very good. However, some states have passed laws or do what they can to restrict the participation of those public entities. So we're very glad to see them encouraged in BEAD. Local coordination, another requirement. States have to reach out across their geographic region. They have to find diverse groups of stakeholders for whom broadband is important, which is everyone. But this will include labor unions, include schools, include nonprofits, include businesses. Like you have to bring them into the planning process. And you have to reach out through multiple methods of awareness, multiple languages. You have to make sure people know what you're doing. It has to be a transparent process, and you have to make an effort to include historically marginalized groups. So this is a great requirement, and we're very happy to see it in the BEAD program. And then finally, on the actual networks that BEAD will fund, there are a lot of affordability requirements. And this leads back to our earlier conversation about the ACP. Like this will require the infrastructure itself to provide affordable service. So this will bring down the cost of service while the ACP subsidizes the remainder. So these work hand in hand. So subgrantees are required to do 2 things. They have to have a low cost service option. So any network operator on a BEAD network has to offer a plan that is low cost, which hopefully means about a $30 plan that has high speeds. Because if those BEAD publicly funded networks offer that plan, then combined with the ACP, that's free internet. So they have to have a low cost plan, and NTIA has some recommendations. And then they also have to have a middle class affordability plan, which is generally a plan to just bring down the cost of broadband more generally. And NTIA has some suggestions like additional and expanded subsidies on top of or bigger than the ACP, and then just offering low cost plans, incentivizing competition, which is a long-term solution to affordability, and then just weighting grant applications according to their affordability or open access pro-competition type qualities. And this is the last, my takeaway for BEAD. So just as a reminder, this is a BEAD gives states the money, and then the federal government approves their programs. So state decisions, federal approval. The intention is to build fast, affordable, universal internet service. Everyone in the proposed region, every household in the proposed region should have access to the network. So you have to offer service to everyone in the area you're proposing to serve. And then the tiering system is unserved first, underserved, and then other uses. So that's the core of BEAD. And then things you can do, or that should know, submit a letter of intent now, again, to get $5 million. Participate in the planning process and encourage other community organizations to participate, because this is the time when we're going to design the plans that are going to be built over the next 5 years, and then last for 20. Encourage good mapping at the state level. I didn't mention it earlier, but this money can be spent to connect and multiple dwelling units like apartments and public housing. The FCC's maps, which again underlie everything, probably aren't going to do a good job of recognizing connectivity in multi-dwelling units. This is a problem because it means they're not going to be eligible for BEAD funding. But if you can, in your state maps and in the planning process, show MDU connectivity, then those projects will be, then MDUs will be eligible for that first tier of BEAD funding. So it's very important to get MDUs mapped so that they can participate early, because MDUs in urban areas are historically neglected and left out of broadband funding. And then also watch for state legislation. A lot of states, notably Illinois, have tried to pass legislation that would limit or even make the state ineligible for BEAD funding. So it's crazy to think that that would happen, but it has. It has happened recently, and it will continue to happen. And Adriana can talk about California's recent victories on this front, but so just keep your eye on the legislature. And with that, I will pass it to Amy.
Thank you, Drew, and welcome, Amy, to talk about the Digital Equity Act. I did see a question in the chat. I just want to make sure everyone knows that California has submitted their letter, and Amy was kind enough to put a link to an article that showed which 34, I think that was the number, states and territories have already submitted those letters. Okay, Amy, over to you to talk about the Digital Equity Act.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Drew, and thank you, Miguel, for having me here today. It's really a privilege and an honor to get to be here. So a couple of things. So Drew did a wonderful job explaining the BEAD and ACP program, and as the Digital Equity Act is kind of the third prong of this suite of programs that Congress devised in the Infrastructure Act. And they really did intend for all of these programs to hang together and to complement each other, and all together to work towards closing the digital divide. And without any one of them, we all believe that this won't work, and without good coordination and all of us working together. So I'm going to give an overview of the Digital Equity Act writ large, but focus really in on one portion of it because that's the pot of funds that's now available. Next slide, please. So the Digital Equity Act is a subcomponent of the broadband section of the Infrastructure Act. It's $2.75 billion, and it's split into two programs. The first is the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program, and then the second is a Federal Competitive Grant Program. And you can see the breakdown here. There's $1.5 billion for the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program and $1.25 billion for the Federal Competitive Grant Awards. The State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program is then broken out into two subgrants. The first is for state digital equity plans, and the second is for the implementation of those plans or capacity building. There's $60 million set aside for building state digital equity plans, and then $1.44 billion for implementing those plans. Next slide, please. And Adrian did go over the definitions before you saw of digital equity and digital inclusion and covered populations, but I just want to bring them up again here because all of those are really integral to this program. And at NDIA, we talk about as digital equity is our goal. That's what we're trying to achieve, making sure everyone has the capacity needed to really thrive in today's society that's virtually online. And then digital inclusion is how we get there. It's the programs, the policies, and the tools. In covered populations, it's a mix. It's a weird term that Congress put out, frankly, but it basically are the vulnerable populations. It's the seniors and the people who are typically disconnected from the internet, low-income households, veterans, people of that nature. So as we go through, just remember that Congress really delineated those covered populations because they want states and they want organizations throughout states to really focus on closing the digital divide for these vulnerable populations, and to make sure that these disenfranchised folks really have the internet that they need and the skills and everything that they need to thrive. So the goal of the digital equity programs writ large is to promote the closure of the digital divide and promote digital equity and inclusion. The state digital equity capacity grant program, as we talked about, is split into 2 grants. Only the first part of that program has NTIA created what we call a Nofo, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, for yet, and they released that last Friday. They have not yet released any guidance or opened funding amounts for the second part, which is the implementation. We can talk a bit more about that in a moment. But some things that really stood out to us in this Notice of Funding Opportunity that came out Friday around the planning grants, and remember that 60 million, is that it opened up these dollars for not only states, which in the context of the Nofo means the 50 states plus DC plus Puerto Rico, it opened it up for all territories to create digital equity plans, which is really exciting. And it also opened up funds for tribal organizations to create digital equity plans or to use an allocation to participate in their state's digital equity planning process. Which is also really exciting because that language wasn't in the law itself. And so NTA was able to, in their read of the law, was able to allocate these funds. The other thing that it does is that it really tightly, again, links the Digital Equity Act plans to the BEAD 5-year action plans. And in fact, it delineates that not only, and it is in the BEAD Nofo as well, is not only will states be required to look at digital equity if states participate in the Digital Equity Act planning program and create a plan from these funds, then that can count as their digital equity component in the BEAD program 5-year action plan. So meaning it's really to the state's benefit to participate in this Digital Equity Act plan program, because these funds will help create a plan and provide the funds to do so, to really that will strengthen your BEAD program plans, but then also that's already a requirement of the BEAD program. So this will help you fulfill that obligation. And the other thing that the Nofo does, and this is also outlined in the law, is it really does have a lot of standards for what comprehensive coordination with local stakeholders means. And it really encourages states to talk to people, to find out what it's like for them to live in the digital divide, and particularly those covered populations, to understand their needs and their gaps so that they can create programs that really address them and that they can outline what those things will be in the plan. In order to apply, the application process will be a bit different for the states versus tribal organizations and territories. States will need to submit an application by July 12th, so less than 60 days at this point. And the tribal organizations or territories will need to submit a letter of intent by that same date. NTIA expects that they will begin distributing the funds by September 29th, at the earliest is what they say, at the earliest in the Nofo. And again, it is up to governors to designate who will be, they call it an administering entity, who will be the state's administering entity for the Digital Equity Act programs. And that's not just for the planning, that's for the planning and the implementation. Next slide, please. So the Nofo, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, these are what the requirements are in the act itself for what should be in a state digital equity plan. Identifying the barriers to digital equity faced by covered populations, we talked about that, and then creating some measurable objectives for promoting a couple of things that work towards closing the digital divide specifically for those covered populations. So things like digital literacy, making sure that there's fixed and wireless broadband technology for everyone and affordability of it. Then assessing how the goals and objectives that states create in the plan, how those align with their other goals and objectives that they already have documented in their other plans throughout the state. So if they have a state economic development plan, how those align with those, et cetera. How then they're supposed to outline how they plan to collaborate with key stakeholders, and then outline again who they've collaborated with in developing the plan, but then also will collaborate with in implementing the plan. Next slide, please. So that was what was required in the law itself. NTIA also provided a bit more detail of what should be in a plan in the Nofo, starting with, states really have an opportunity to create a vision for what digital equity means in their state. And they encourage states to do, NTIA encourages states to do so. They really encourage states to actually create a real coordination and outreach strategy to document that, what that strategy is. A description of how the existing local plans can be incorporated in the state digital equity plan, because many states actually, so I'm from North Carolina, and I still live in North Carolina. North Carolina already has 13 or 15 digital equity plans across the state in different counties. And by the end of this year, there will be 50 digital equity plans in different counties. And so North Carolina will have a real opportunity to incorporate those plans into its planning process and to learn what the communities have already learned about their communities and what their goals are for their own communities. So states will be required to do that. And then there's a couple other things that states will be required to do in their planning process, like delineate how they will implement these plans, a timeline for what that implementation will be like, and then how the implementation of the Digital Equity Act plans will align with the BEAD plans, and then other federal and funds like American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and if there's any private digital equity funding in the states. Next slide, please. So that was the first half of the program. The second half of the program is competitive grants. So that's actually, these are open to any, well, not any, but it's a long laundry list of types of organizations. That includes folks like community-based organizations, community anchor institutions, state agencies other than the organization that will be administering these programs, higher education, et cetera. This will be a competitive process once these funds are released. One thing I forgot to note about the state digital equity capacity grant program is that's formula based. So there's a formula outlined by Congress in the act, and the amounts that each state and territory will get are based on that formula. The amounts that states and territories will get for the planning dollars is actually already listed in the Nofo. So if you're curious what your state or territory will receive, we'll make sure to drop a link in the chat of where you can go find those numbers. I don't know them offhand. I apologize. But for the competitive grants, it's a competitive, and it will the amounts will be competitive, and anyone across the country, or many organizations across the country, will be vying for this 1.25 billion, and they'll be applying directly to NTIA for these funds. You see a lot of TBD on this slide because we don't know a lot right now about when these programs this specific program will open up. One thing that NTI still has yet to do for this program and for the implementation dollars for the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program is they still have yet to release a what's called a request for comments, which is basically their public comment period. So they still have to do that. And then they have to synthesize those comments, and then they have to create a Nofos for these two programs. So that is still yet to come. So there's still quite a bit we don't know about the timing of these programs. However, when NTIA released their Nofos on Friday and their big announcement about all the different programs, and they're calling it Internet for All, all these programs are under this Internet for All umbrella. They did release some one-pagers on the programs. And within those one-pagers, they had a few timelines. In that timeline, we did see that the competitive grant launch is at least tentatively set for fall 2024. So that is what we know so far about when these will go live. Next slide, please. And here is the timeline that is from that helpful one-pager that we will make sure to put a link in the chat. So the Nofos did as the BEAD program, they all went live on Friday. So you see where we are right now. States now have until, again, well, NTIA has their own timeline wrong. We didn't put these dates in there. I want to point that out. They have until the 12th to submit their applications or their letters of intent. Once they submit those applications and letter of intent, likely around after September 29th, they'll receive the funds. Once they receive the funds, they have 1 year to create the plans, and then they'll submit those plans. And around or about that time, we anticipate NTIA will open up the implementation grants or the capacity grants, and they'll have to submit those plans as part of that application to receive those implementation or capacity grant awards. We then expect the capacity grants to launch. It looks like early 2024, mid 2024, and then the competitive applications likely will open up in mid 2024 to late 2024. The states have a 5-year time frame for implementation, and then the organizations that receive the competitive awards will have a 4-year time frame for implementation. And with that, I think I'm done.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to move on and introduce you to someone who's probably familiar with, that you all are familiar with. Adriana Sanchez is with Next Gen California, and she's going to specifically drill down on some of the incredible activities. I was saying earlier when we were gabbing prior to the start of the webinar that Drew and Adriana and others, Michelson, are very lucky to live in a state that is really ahead of many, many other states in the union thinking about these issues. So Adriana, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. And thank you, Miguel and the Michelson Foundation for having me. Thank you to the panelists on this group. Lots of great information. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. But as Adrian said, California is a state that has, in many areas, been very progressive and has led in a lot of issue areas, and broadband and digital equity is one of them. So I would like to start by, first of all, introducing a coalition that was just recently formed. It's the California Alliance for Digital Equity, and you'll see on the bottom of the slide the founding partners of the alliance. The California Alliance for Digital Equity, there's a slide that shows this, but I'll just briefly say it. It really is a dedicated group of local and statewide advocates that are focusing on digital equity and inclusion. And we do this focusing on device acquisition, broadband access, digital literacy, and workforce training. So our legislative, budgetary, programmatic, and regulatory advocacy addresses all of the aspects of digital divide. So we welcome you, and I'll share a little bit about this at the end on how you can join our efforts here in California. Next slide, Drew. So as I was saying a little bit early, California has really been leading the way in broadband. We have had some historic budget investments in broadband deployment, which have set low-cost standards. And for other states and the federal government to model. We have proposed legislation currently that is tackling affordability and equity issues that can be found across the country. We are currently monitoring two of our big priority bills, which just got out of Appropriations Committee. I've been monitoring this and monitoring the Appropriations Committee hearing, and they both got out. So they'll be moving to the Legislative Assembly floor for a vote. And we'll talk about those a little bit later in the slide. So yes, historic broadband events, we have set low cost standards for other states to be able to follow, and then tackling issues of affordability, like I just mentioned. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about the mission of the California Alliance for Digital Equity, and this is the slide that I was referring to. Next, Drew. Okay, so here's where we get into some of the fun stuff and the meat of what we're doing in California. In July of last year, Governor Newsom signed $6 billion worth of infrastructure money in a broadband legislation. And the way that this has been broken down is $3.25 billion of this money is to build and operate and maintain an open access state-owned middle mile network. We have $2 billion to set up last mile broadband connections that expedites project deployment and also enables tribes and local governments to access this funding. And then we have $700 million for loan loss revenue fund. In April of this year, the CPUC proposed a decision to set standards for CASF, which is the California Advanced Service Fund, that promote affordable broadband. In May of this year, our May budget revision included an additional $11 million for middle mile build out. And this summer, our work will continue in the advocacy space to ensure that equity is front and center in all California's broadband investments. Next. So one of the things that we have talked about here in California is how do we hold internet providers accountable, right? How do we ensure that they're actually serving the people of California, in particular, the communities of color? I think that that is one of the things that Next Gen Policy has really focused on. We're a justice equity organization. And so the folks that we have partnered with really is about figuring out how we hold them accountable. And we do this by creating legislation that puts them in a position where they come after us. Last year was a big loss for them in this $6 billion bill that was signed. And so this year they're coming after us and coming in for the win. So ISPs routinely offer faster, more affordable, so more megabytes per second internet to high income communities than to low income communities. Drew showed that a little bit in the slides that he shared with you. There's a lack of competition and independent local responsive options that drive prices high. The Biden announcement last week to partner with ISPs was a welcome and positive voluntary agreement. I will repeat that again. So there's actually no accountability or transparency that were attached to his announcement. And that's very problematic. And so that is something that we're focusing on as well. Next slide. Our priorities for 2022, as I talked about last year, we really focused on the infrastructure part of broadband, and we tabled after in the fall of last year, affordability and access. And so this year, there are two bills that CADE is focusing on. One is AB 2748, Mr. Holden, the Digital Equity in Video Franchising Act of 2022, and AB 2751, Mr. Garcia, the Affordable Internet and Equity Act of 2022. So, and then also the California Broadband for All initiative. And next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the bills. So 2748 is the Digital Equity and Video Franchising Act of 2022. Sort of ironic and not, our executive director was actually one of the people 15 years ago in 2006 that while working for the Speaker of the state of California, enacted DIVCA. And as we know, everything needs reform. Things need to be updated. And so we have a personal attachment to this bill because as he was involved in the initial creation of DIVCA, we are now involved in reforming DIVCA. And so what DIVCA is the need that there is to reform DIVCA would increase what the initial thought, right, was to increase competition between internet service providers and then increasing broadband access to improve service quality, reduce prices. But 15 years later, we all now know that DIVCA has failed to deliver on these. And so 2748 would make comprehensive changes to reform and update DIVCA so that it meets the needs of all communities and helps close the digital divide. Specifically, what this bill would do would renew the process for cable franchising, and it strengthens equal access, oversight, and anti-discrimination requirements, which again will lead to greater broadband access, quality, and affordability, which is a big focus of ours. Next, Drew. The next bill is the Affordable Internet and Net Equality Act of 2022. This is the only affordability bill that is currently being run through the California legislature. Extremely important. As we know, or we don't, or we can share now, more than half Californians who lack access to home broadband service can't afford it. It's too much, it's too prohibitive. And I think California doesn't have a broadband affordability program to assist lower income families, similar to those that we have in the utility sector. And we have, low income programs for almost everything. We don't have it for broadband. So what this bill does is creates the Net Equality Program. It offers, it would require internet service providers, ISPs, that do business within the state of California, one, to offer low-income households an affordable broadband option that meets minimum speed thresholds. And as Drew showed in his slide, served, underserved, there's a big difference in what that means and how households actually can carry on. And so we have to ensure that they have the minimum speeds to be able to at least do the minimum, right, in their households. And it also provides technical assistance to support and facilitate signups for households. Next, Drew. We also are engaged in the regulatory process. The California Public Utility Commission, the CPUC, and the California Department of Technology and other state agencies are committed to the California Broadband for All initiative. It's an effort to bring access to affordable, high quality internet service to all communities in our state. And many of our CADE founding partners have engaged with implementing this initiative since its inception. As a matter of fact, at 11 o'clock today, the CPUC was doing voting. And in recent weeks, the CPUC adopted a decision that sets rules for applications for $2 billion in last mile funding that's been allocated under last year's bill, which was a Senate Bill 156. So we're working very closely with state agencies that are involved in this effort with the goal to increase participation in public workshops, public comment periods, as well as ensure that existing funds support the California Broadband Initiative for All in an equitable and a transparent, accountable manner. You know, voice is important, and being part of this process and actually being able to participate in the comment period is really impactful. Next, Drew. I apologize. I also have a slight cold, so my voice is cracking a little bit. We invite you all to join CADE, add your organization to the growing list of folks that are dedicated to working on the issues of fast, reliable, and affordable internet, digital literacy and navigation support, and then obviously public benefits and programs. Our goal in California is to continue to provide affordable internet, to make it accessible, and to always remember that we represent those communities, disadvantaged communities, Black and Brown communities are our primary focus in ensuring that they have access to broadband. So with that,
thank you.
I think I'm turning it to Adrian. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much. And Drew, why don't we just quickly show the next 3 slides? So since Miguel will be sending the slides out to anybody who's attended, each of our organizations, Benton, Common Sense, and NDIA, we put together some links and some resources to your sites, to resources on our sites, and let you know that there's a lot out there for you to look at, including some of the resources that we pointed to today, and to which I also appreciate that Amy put some things on the chat. I think we'll open it up to Q&A right now. But you know, Miguel, we answered a few things that were asked during the session, like did California submit their LOI? And the answer was yes, along with 34 other states and territories. And Amy has posted another couple of resources for everybody, but I didn't see any other questions. Oh, here we go. Aha, in the Q&A. Let's see. I think we've answered, are only state agencies eligible to apply for the 5 million? This was asked about the planning grants for BEAD, or can nonprofit organizations apply as well? And Drew, I believe you answered that it's only state agencies designated by the governor's office. And then somebody's asking, is there a benefit? And I would agree, yes. I will say yes, but I'm going to have one of my panelists answer. A benefit to having Lifeline and ACP. Should we be promoting one or the other, or both? I'm going to drop in the chat a link to a report that Benton wrote, but we're absolutely big believers in stacking these benefits. You can apply them to a single program, or you can separate them and apply them to different programs. But maybe Amy and Drew also want to take a stab at that question.
Yeah, I'll hop in since I tried to answer it as Drew was talking, so he could focus on talking. Yeah, so the Lifeline benefit, for those who don't know, is a virtually $10 benefit that can be applied to a phone, cell phone service, or a broadband. However, Lifeline is a bit more restricted on which providers accept Lifeline, et cetera, than perhaps Affordable Connectivity Program. And Affordable Connectivity Program, remember, is $30 benefit. So together they can create a $40 benefit if you stack them. So use them towards, say, your cell service, or if you split them up, which is absolutely possible. You can apply the Lifeline to, say, a mobile service, and then the ACP to a wireline service for your home. We definitely recommend that folks who are eligible for both apply for and leverage both.
Drew, do you have anything to add there?
Use them both, just like Amy said.
That's exactly right. And we're actually asking the FCC to better coordinate the programs. They're administered by the same back office, which is the USAC. And we want to make sure that it's a smooth process for people to be enrolled in both and not have it be difficult. Yes, definitely. Thank you, Amy. I don't see any other questions. Miguel? There you are. Anyway, thank you so much for the opportunity, as usual, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. We certainly enjoyed presenting. Thank you.
There was one more question that I saw that Cammie's helping me answer, but the California Digital Equity Plan, I believe there's legislation currently, Mia Banta's legislation, AB 2750, that will decide who's in charge of the California Digital Equity Plan. Thank you, Cammie, for helping me with that. So that's for Brenda.
Okay.
Your question.
There is one more question on the chat. Drew mentioned it was difficult to apply for ACP. Can you discuss? I'm going to mention one thing we've been hearing a lot, and I do want to say one thing. I'm going to brag on NDIA for a second. one of the things that's really great about being a coalition of organizations on the ground that are in fact helping people with a lot of this is we get a lot of what I call ugly stories that come out about, and then what NDIA has done is create a sort of Q&A and highlight some of these things so that we can inform people, for instance, about this example. If you sign up as John Williams, but your official ID that you need to submit is John J. Williams, your application will be kicked out of the system. So one of the things we always say is make sure that how you sign up matches the identification that you will supply to the program. That's just one of the difficulties that we hear about. Amy, maybe you might point out a couple of other things that have been constant drumbeat from the community.
Yeah, and Drew can jump in here as well. So a couple of things. One, it's a two-part application process. So anytime it's not just a one-step shop, that makes it you lose people. So the first part is you apply and are verified as eligible. You apply to the FCC directly through their verifier mechanism program application. And then you take that verification to the internet service provider and enroll. There are just a number of small things that can kick people out. For instance, if you are a Lifeline participant or were in the past, I think is something we've heard is that you were in the past, but perhaps that you're when it came time for you to re-enroll in the Lifeline program, you didn't for whatever reason, or maybe didn't have the application was sent to your old address or whatnot. If that Lifeline verification is lapsed, then it can be quite hard to get into the ACP program. We've heard that it's difficult for tribal communities you have to have an address, and in tribal communities, oftentimes addresses are different than in other areas of the country. And so plugging in that has been difficult. But there's a host of things that have been difficult for folks, and not least of which understanding which plans are eligible from different internet service providers. They're all supposed to be at this point, but everyone's marketing them differently. And oftentimes the customer service folks haven't necessarily been trained on the program, and so don't have the best information when they're talking to people, and there can be confusion there. So there's a host of things that just make it quite difficult.
So Amy, I'd love to have you put the page that refers people to the Q&A on the website. The good news is that if you are enrolled in Lifeline and you haven't let it lapse, then you automatically qualify for ACP. So that is something that should be widely or more widely publicized. But I think the other thing that we see is that there's a trust issue. A lot of people are sitting there saying, I don't trust that if I get sign up for a $30 subsidy that's matched with a $30 plan from my provider, that I'm not going to get dinged at some point for money later. And so having a trusted community organization involved in the process, I think really does smooth over. And that's why, frankly, the one thing we were excited about, we weren't excited about the accountability that Adriana said, but the one thing we were excited about was the partnering with trusted organizations to try to get the word out and really provide that hand-holding that I think is necessary for a lot of community members that just for whatever reason have been burned by processes previously. Drew?
Yeah, everything that Amy said, I want to amplify it. As she says, a two-step process. You usually have to go to the FCC to get approved for the ACP, and then you have to go find an ISP. So like, if you're a working parent or if you're busy, like this might fall down your priority list. And it takes two unique actions to do it at best. probably 3, because you figure out what it is, you figure out what documents you need, you got to go back home, you got to call the school to get the report card so you can show that your student's in the program. Then you get approved, then you got to take your number to the ISP and go through that whole process. So it can be a lot. So that's why the assistance is important, and follow-up touch points. Common Sense is actually going to launch a pilot program that's with the objective of 2 different things: to raise awareness about the ACP, because it's a new program, a lot of people don't know it exists, or it sounds like a scam. So we want to raise awareness, and then 2, we want to direct eligible people who are interested to digital navigators like NDIA members who can help them enroll in the program, because having that human contact is vital. And actually the California Emerging Technology Fund is doing a lot of good work on that front, and we're in talks with them. And the other thing I want to raise is that there is a $100 device benefit, a one-time $100 device benefit. And having a device is essential to using the internet. Regrettably, most ISPs that are participating in the ACP aren't also offering devices. So if you're having trouble affording the internet, you're probably having trouble affording the devices. The ACP will get you the internet, but not always the device. So that's another barrier. And that, we talked about it earlier, but the Emergency Connectivity Fund, like there are currently some programs that are giving some devices, but there isn't any real good source. Like the ECF may end, and there aren't any other sources for device funding. So that's another critical piece that we're working to address, but has not yet been addressed. If you could use some other federal funds to make device programs, like the capital projects funds, which all states should be using, and we did not talk about today. But there are options, but no one is yet pursuing them.
There is a small match to the device. I believe it is between $10 and $50 in order to get that device. So that's something else that we should let people know. I'm putting into the chat, Benton has done 3 separate articles talking about our wireless, cable, and phone companies actually offering ACP, and how easy is it to find the program on people's websites. That's the other issue. It may actually be available, but you may have to dive into a website and go 3 or 4 pages in to find it. And so sometimes that is, that's very difficult. Any other, I don't see any other questions in the site. Oh, wait, here we go. No, I think we are good. Oh, okay. No, I think Miguel, you had another one. Are only state agencies eligible to apply for the 5 million? No, I think we did that one. Or can nonprofit organizations apply as well? For BEAD, only state agencies. For the DEA, the 60 million?
It needs, well, the governor is going to designate the administrative entity, which is can be a state agency. I mean, it can be like a university system or some other types of organizations, but they'll do that in their application when they submit their applications in July.
Yes, I've heard a state library system being appointed, so that's correct. As long as the governor has appointed you for the DEA, then you can do that.
We have one last one, Adrian. Which states match Medicaid and SNAP data?
Oh, that's something we really are pushing for. Not very many is the answer. Amy, do you have a better handle on exact numbers? We'd certainly love to see that, because I think it hits that senior population that's always been under enrolled in these programs.
I don't have a better answer. It's not enough though. Drew, do you know?
I don't know which, but yeah, it's a great question.
Great. I think that is the questions that folks have dropped in. So I'll just hop in and thank Adrian for guiding us this morning, afternoon for some, and to all of our amazing panelists, just for shedding light on where we are with IIJA, and what can still be done to leverage those resources in really meaningful and equitable ways. Here in California, I really do want to emphasize and underline CADE, the California Alliance for Digital Equity. That group is coming together to really set up the sort of community response, right, to major ISPs push to turn back the clock on major gains made over the past year or so. So definitely encourage folks to visit the website. I know somebody dropped the link in the chat, so check it out. A lot of activity going on there. Thank you so much to our attendees for your continued engagement and for being champions of digital equity as well. We just hope that today's discussion has painted a clear picture of where these historic investments in broadband are going. Most importantly, we just really hope that you walk away with a sense of how you can ensure that equity, again, is at the forefront of how these dollars are spent. So why the Infrastructure Investment and Job Acts matters, a breakdown and an update was presented by the Michelson 20MM Foundation in service of advancing digital equity for all students and families. We want to thank our foundation partners, the California Community Foundation, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and Southern California Grantmakers. We'll post a recording of today's discussion on our YouTube channel, the Michelson 20MM Foundation, by tomorrow. The video will include links in the description so that you may join the Connecting California LinkedIn group, a dedicated space to foster collaboration in California to advance digital equity and close the divide faster and together. If you or your organization want to become part of our digital equity work, please reach out to me directly at miguel@20mm.org. You can also stay engaged by signing up for our newsletter at 20mm.org to receive news and updates about Connecting California, as well as our other events and programs. Thanks again for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next Connecting California event. Thank you so much. Take care.